What's going on, guys? Welcome to In the Zone. I'm your host, Garrison Roy, and today we're going to go into a little bit of a deep dive. It's been a minute since we've done a deep dive, so I wanted to go ahead and give you guys some educational content, right? The small little intricacies of the game to kind of help out with skill or performance training, whatever it might be to help you get in your zone. But we also have those rants. Uh, Episodes. I've been doing a few of those lately, just discussing some hot topics or things kind of on my mind or calling out some BS in the industry, right? And then we also have the full length interviews. Those are conversations with experts, athletes, and coaches. And then also mental minutes. I'll probably have to kick back up on those a little bit more as well. The quick mental game hacks to help elevate your performance. And if there's anything specific that you guys want to hear about, or maybe want to get a little bit more into the nitty gritty on, even with these deep dives as well, feel free to hit me up, right? Any social media platform that you see me on, or reach out in the zone podcast 123 at gmail.com. And just remember, share the episode if you get any value out of this. Is how I do this. I'm literally probably not only losing time necessarily, shouldn't say losing, but a lot of time is allocated towards this podcast. And I don't do any sponsorships or monetize the show in any way. So all that time, all the funds that actually go towards doing this, because this isn't free for me to do this, right? But again, it's all for you for free. So as much as I give you guys, all I ask for you to do in exchange, post it on your story or send it to a friend that might need to hear it, right? I mean, I think that's the least that you could do, right? It's a little bit of reciprocation from what I'm doing here. But without further ado, I want to kind of get into this topic of stretching, right? And this deep dive, we'll get into this a little bit more. And obviously, a lot of people have different schools of thought of what is the correct way or the correct timing of stretching. And I get questions all the time like, hey, coach, why don't we do more static stretches? Or, oh, hey, do you ever have your athletes do static stretching or, any type of stretching before? And my blunt answer is not really, to be honest. Obviously, if there is a need there and a guy is really restricted in mobility, right, I'm definitely going to have some of that. But I lean a little bit more towards dynamic stretching. And, you could hear all the different types of stretching out there. There's static stretching, the dynamic stretching, like I mentioned before. There's also PNF stretching, and then there's ballistic stretching is probably kind of an older school one that you've probably seen, way back in the day where you see the football guys are all circled around, all around each other, and they're like, all right, well, here we go. 3, 2, 1, and touch your toes. Here we go. But they're bouncing up and down. That's a kind of more ballistic stretch. I typically am not a fan of that one because you're more apt to pull muscles that way, especially if you're doing it cold. So my general rule of thumb with stretching, right, and why I gravitate more towards the dynamic stretching is, you're going through full range of motion. You're actually getting blood flow to the area before doing a static stretch, right? And a good analogy that I use for this is specifically for the static stretching. If you had a rubber band, right, and you put it in the refrigerator or the freezer, or even just put it in cold weather outside, and all of a sudden you decided you just wanted to maximally stretch that. Okay, obviously it's going to feel a little brittle. It's going to be a little stiff. And the chances of you breaking that by going to that full length is pretty high, right? I mean, even you just doing it and trying to me and imagining it, I'm like kind of wincing to make sure that I don't let that rubber band pop back and hit me in the face. So why would we do that with our bodies, with our muscles, with our tendons and ligaments, right? We need blood flow to those areas. And more specifically, and you can kind of go on tangents here for tendons and ligaments, those have less blood flow supply than the muscles. So really, the whole point of getting warm up is to get blood flow to certain areas that you're about to use or, get after. Not to kind of veer off of this topic, but I'm also a huge fan of winning warm-ups, which are like right before a workout, or that first set of your workout rather, that you're doing what most people would do is call the accessory lifts. You would actually do those before, get blood flow to that area, and then go right into whatever main lifts that you have for that day. I think that's really awesome way to kind of not only get more hypertrophy, but get more out of your training session because you're getting more blood flow to the areas that you're getting ready to work. So everything's ready to turn on and get ready to rock and roll. But with all of those there, and again, there's a bonus stretch that I'm going to kind of throw out here a little bit for you guys to kind of do some research on. Um, but from some of the research that I found, and I'll put all these studies in the show notes for you guys to kind of check in for yourself. But static stretching, right? It's that long stretch, extended period of time. You see the guys throwing their arm across their chest, and they're like 1, 2, 3, yeah. See, it just sounds monotonous, right? Usually that typically ranges from anywhere from 10, sometimes 60 seconds. But there was research that doing this before activities, whether that's training or an actual game or any type of performance, does decrease your muscle strength and power output if it's held for too long, right? Now, what's too long? I think that's really more dependent on the athlete and what they've been exposed to. But it's also more beneficial as a cool down routine to improve some of that flexibility and stiffness. So like if you're getting really, really tight, let's say in your triceps, and you just did a pressing or a push workout routine, right? I think that would be a good time for you to introduce some of the static stretching and just kind of loosen that up a little bit and not let it get as stiff. Again, post workout. Now, my favorite one, like I mentioned before, is the dynamic stretching, right? That's full integrative parts, really just not compartmentalizing or isolating certain muscles. You're just kind of moving everything all at once and getting ready to rock and roll. And you see that where teams go down, they line up and they go and jump around. They do some lunges, they do, rotational twists, they'll do some arm circles, right? Those are considered dynamic stretching, right? And that's found to be more beneficial before sports activities and also does somewhat improve performance, but it's increasing the muscle temperature, right? So it improves that blood flow, and it also gets a higher neuromuscular adaptation or function to get the body prepared for any specific movements that it's getting ready to do. So that's the second one. And a bonus for this, like I mentioned before, within the dynamic stretching, you want to have some type of cognitive input, right? It's not just you monotonously going through the same thing over and over and over again. You need to be engaged. You need to be willing to go in and do whatever it is that you're doing with your mind attached to it. Otherwise, you're just going through the motions, right? And I will put a awesome example list of YouTube videos that I got from Tanner Pruitt, who's with MASH, and he goes in and actually has several examples on this YouTube playlist where he goes in and is like, hey, let's try to add a stick, or let's add a partner, where they have to basically react or respond based on what's going on around them in their environment or whatever specific task that is assigned for them, right? And it's not too structured in a way where it's like, hey, this is the only way that you're able to do this stretch. No, it's actually a little bit more open-ended where it's like, hey, show me how many different ways you can do this or do this. And I think that's huge. And especially as a coach, you can observe that and see what guys gravitate towards on how they respond or how they warm up and what they kind of steer away from. Sometimes that can help you give them a little bit more of a nudge in certain directions to give them, a little bit more exposure the other way. So for example, let's say a guy, he's, always going to the left side. If you have a stick and you're dropping it and lunging because he has more range of mobility on that left side. Well, it's like, hey, let's try to mix it up and go 1-for-1, or hey, I notice you're doing more on this side. Let's do more this way. Or hey, I notice you're only going forward on your lunges. Let's try to do a couple more, in reverse or whatever it might be to kind of open up their degrees of freedom, not only physically degrees of freedom, but mentally what their degrees of freedom are, of letting them know that, hey, brain, we can move this way, we can do this, we have success in doing these things, right? So huge type of integration. Obviously, if you're coaching younger kids, you want to have some type of a structure. So you probably would want to start with a very regimented, having things scripted out. But maybe towards the end there, you make it a little bit more dynamic or a little bit more fun to allow some of that cognitive engagement towards the end. And they're going to be more focused in practice, which I think is awesome. The third one, I think a lot of guys are familiar with this, especially in the strength and conditioning realm, is the PNF stretching or proprioceptive neuromuscular facilitation. And there's been different variations of this. I think pale rails kind of fall into this category. The controlled articular rotations or CARs, I think, are a little bit more dynamic, just more focused on the end ranges. And again, very scripted, some things that you could probably do in a little bit different setting than right before a game, unless you feel like you need those. But with PNF stretching, not to get off topic, this is just controlling the muscle group being targeted. So think of an active static stretch in a way, right? That it can actually help improve some flexibility. So for example, we'll go back to this cross arm body tricep stretch. Instead of just hanging out here and pulling and tugging at it, I'm actively trying to push against the arm that's trying to withhold and stretch. And so now I'm actually getting a little bit more neuromuscular recruitment in those areas, right? And helping, again, it's still a little isolated, but it's also a little bit more active. And when you release from that, right, kind of the concept of the pale rails, progressive angular isometric loading, or regressive angular isometric loading, again, depending on how you want to look at this. But again, sticking with that tricep example, you can start here a little bit less than that range by pushing and then release, and notice that you get maybe just a hair further with that. And then again, you can press. So you're progressing that movement and then relaxing, regressing. Usually that's in 10-second time frames of pushing, relaxing, and then pulling. A really good one for that would also be ankles. And again, forgive me if I'm butchering this, and I know for those of you who are really big into that type of stuff, especially the ones who've been certified in that, I know there's a lot more scientific basis behind that, and I'm probably butchering it, but I'm just kind of giving that as an example for those who might know what it is. So again, these are pre-activity. I think they're not terrible. But they can cause a little bit of muscle fatigue depending on how much effort you're putting into it, right? So if I'm going 100% effort, really pushing up against this thing, right? It could be a little bit fatiguing, and it could kind of downgrade a little bit of some of the power output because of how fatiguing it is, right? So just be aware of that, making sure if you do that, like maybe keep it at a moderate intensity, and just allow and have some feel for that. But again, I think that's a better alternative than static stretching. So if you're feeling tighter in an area, I think that's probably a better route to go. And again, not trying to demonize static stretching. It's not what I'm trying to do here. I just think if you're trying to effectively warm up, you need to engage your brain. You need to engage full body movements that you're about to do within the sport, and not isolated ones. Now, the fourth one, that's the big super bonus that not a lot of people know about, maybe a couple of you who are in the performance realm or have been around some things for a while, or maybe physical therapists, you guys have learned this, but I think it's really, really effective. And I wanted to kind of go over this. And also in lieu of the gentleman who created this concept, Dr. Guy Voyer. He recently just passed away, but it did kind of give me a little bit of a reminisce when I saw that and kind of went back. It's like, oh yeah, this dude really came up with a lot of great things within the industry of performance. And that is the Eldoa stretches. And I'm not even going to try to pronounce that, but it's basically a French of like étirements longitudinus avec decapitation osteo-articulate. Wow, that's a mouthful, right? But again, the guy's French, so he kind of put it all in there. But for short, Eldoa. And that's basically trying to create space within the joints, most in particular the spine, stretching out fascia and muscles around the joints. And unbeknownst to me, I actually did find out about a year or two ago that you can also do Eldoa stretches in the shoulder and in the elbow. I honestly don't know how to do those. Definitely want to learn how to do those eventually. But the ones that I'm more familiar with and some that actually helped with some of my lower back pain was the spinal decompression Eldoas, right? So they're more targeted towards like L5, S1, L4, L5. And think about those discs, right? There's a bunch of muscles around those that are compressing and pulling those things down and having those discs shrink a little bit. But if you allow the muscles around it and you try to pull them or stretch them out, it's going to decompress that area a little bit more, right? Um, and again, it's generally trying to use the muscles and the levers that are already in the body, and you manipulate your hands and move it certain ways to where they're going to be able to pull and decompress those areas. Definitely recommend checking those out. And those are really, really specific. So even if you do watch a YouTube video, you kind of need a little bit more expertise to know how to change maybe the hand angle or the certain positions to be able to get the full output of that. Because this is really an active stretch. If you're just kind of sitting there and just holding your hands in a certain position, passively standing there, you're not getting anything out of it like you should, right? These are a lot more, you know, really, I think they're taxing. Like I'm literally sweating bullets after I just do one. And sometimes I can't even get to the full minute hold that usually is prescribed for. Sometimes I have to break it up into 30-second segments, right? Um, but yeah, it's all about the body positioning and certain postures that target that segment, or you could go the T-spine, you could go cervical route, whatever it is that you're there, right? But you're holding that position for like I said, usually a minute, and you focus on your breathing, maintaining a posture, and maximizing that decompressive force that you're trying to do. And the benefits, obviously, for me having that L5 S1 compression there, that did help a lot with kind of reducing my back pain, but also improve some posture. It helps obviously kind of increase flexibility, because if you're not stiff and compressed, right, it's going to help alleviate a lot of that. And also some athletic performance. I was able to still kind of do jumps and be able to bounce around and demonstrate exercises a lot better from doing these. And it's definitely a staple within my routine. So, but yeah, it's definitely a great one. And I think another way of looking at these too is some of the fascial stretches, right? And you hear about the word fascia, right? And how esoteric it sounds, or people just kind of throw that word around as like, oh yeah, the fascia, when they're really actually probably referring to anatomy trains like slings and not actually fascia itself, even though they are fascially connected. Um, so just be aware of people who say that. I've seen that a few times. And the fascias, if you've ever seen like a beef jerky stick or maybe even a piece of steak where you're trying to peel away the layers and you see these little fine, almost like film-like things, that there is fascia, right? And those have compressive, and especially if you're doing certain movements over and over again, that fascia can get a lot thicker or get stiffer and allow a lot more elasticity through those components, right? Um, but from that, again, you have to make sure that all that connective tissue surrounding it, surrounding the bones, joints, is also getting blood flow. And again, fascia is not necessarily going off of blood flow, but it has a lot of more fluids for water. So if you're dehydrated, trying to do things fascially is probably not going to work out. That's why right after you go to a massage, they recommend what? Drinking more water, essentially to be able to help flush out all of that stuff, mostly also through the lymphatic system as well too. But um, yeah, huge proponent of both of those. And I think if you do have any back pain or anything like that, Eldoas are absolutely huge in getting that in and being a lot more targeted towards the spine, towards certain joints. And there's probably a more better setting for that. You could do that pre-training or pre-performance if you needed to. But again, I think getting blood flow to the area, especially if you're sitting around guys who are coming out of classrooms or driving in a car, being in a bus, right? They're stiff. They're being in the AC, and as soon as they go outside, they need a little bit more blood flow. Now, if it's the summertime and you're sweating your balls off, right? Like, hey, you probably don't need to warm up as much. You're getting blood flow just kind of standing around. But you can still kind of get that through those dynamic movements. More particularly for those guys that are up in the north, right? You get into those cold environments, muscles are stiffer. You got to get some more blood flow, whether that's just a couple jogs here and there. And hey, it could be something as simple for a dynamic warm up. To be honest, it doesn't have to be this huge, grandiose thing. It could be like a flip game, right? You're just dynamically moving up and around and be like, hey, you can't hit this the same way more than once. Spike ball, pick up basketball, whatever it might be. I've seen a bunch of guys just do that to kind of break a sweat. And I've heard this saying before, if your underwear is not wet, then you're not ready to throw. I don't think I would ever go as far to do that. It's pretty extreme, but in essence, it's like, hey, you got to be sweaty and ready before you pick up a baseball or before you start and do any swings. It's a huge pet peeve of mine to see especially some of these younger kids, where they just pick up a bat and go right into it sometimes without doing any type of dynamic warm up. Not saying they're a lot more pliable at younger ages and are very, very durable, but to instill that at a young age, at least just 5 minutes, right? I think that's going to go a long way for them, not only as they move on throughout their careers, but through their life, right? It's going to give them that opportunity to be like, hey, you got to do a little bit of a warm up before you go and crush the gym with, your bros and do a bunch of bench press, right? Like you got to do some type of warm up before you just pop under the bar with 225 and then you know, I've heard horror stories of guys doing something similar to that and ripping their pec and they're down for the count really for their whole life, not even just for their baseball career, right? But all in all, put together with that deep dive, I hope you guys got some great information out of that, all the different types of stretching, and to get cognitive engagement in your stretching. If anything, I want you to get that the most. Please feel free to check out that playlist down there in the show notes and stay in the zone.